Most men are weak, and they don't even know it. They wake up, they go to work, they come home, they scroll, they sleep, and they call this a life. But somewhere, underneath the routine, there is a quiet, constant ache, a feeling they can't name, a sense that something is wrong, but they don't know what. You are not tired, you are undisciplined. You are not unlucky, you are unfocused. You are not misunderstood. You are unwilling to look at yourself honestly, because honesty would demand change, and change is the one thing weak men cannot afford to face. 2,000 years ago, a man sat in a tent on the edge of a battlefield in the cold hills of Germania. He was the most powerful man alive. He commanded legions, nations bent to his word. And yet, every night, by candlelight, he wrote to himself. Not commands, not decrees, confessions. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And in those private pages, he did something almost no man in power has ever done. He admitted his own weakness. He held himself accountable when no one was watching. He understood something most men today will never understand, that the real war is not against the world. It is against the parts of yourself that want to stay small. This is not a video about motivation. Motivation is a drug. It spikes and it fades, and it leaves you exactly where you started, except now you're also disappointed in yourself. This is a video about exposure. By the end of the next hour, you will see yourself in at least one of these 7 patterns. Maybe more than one. Maybe all 7. And when you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. That is the point. Weakness is not about strength in your arms or fear in a fight. The old idea of weak and strong, the one built on muscle and bravado, is a lie sold to boys who never grew up. Real weakness is invisible. It lives in the small decisions. It lives in the way you respond when no one is forcing you to respond a certain way. It lives in the gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Epictetus, a man born into slavery who became one of the most powerful minds in human history, said something that should be carved into the wall of every man's mind. It is not the things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about those things. Read that again. The world is not breaking you. Your reaction to the world is breaking you, and that reaction, that pattern, is built one small surrender at a time. A man does not become weak in a single moment. He becomes weak the way a coastline erodes. Slowly, quietly, wave after wave after wave, until one day he looks in the mirror and does not recognize the shape of what's left. This video will show you 7 of those waves. 7 patterns, 7 daily betrayals that weak men commit against themselves, often without even realizing it. And after each one you will ask yourself a question, not, is this someone else, but, is this me? Because here is the truth nobody wants to hear. The weak man is not a stranger. He is not the man across the street, the co-worker you look down on, the friend who can't get his life together. The weak man is, in some way, in some hour of some day, every single one of us. The difference between a weak man and a strong one is not that the strong man never feels weakness. It is that he refuses to let it run the show. So sit with this. Let it sting. Let it sit in your chest like a stone. Because the men who change, the men who actually become who they were meant to be, are the men who were willing to feel this discomfort all the way through, instead of reaching for their phone to numb it. Seneca once wrote to a friend that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, but there is a darker truth underneath that one. We also lie to ourselves in imagination more than we ever do out loud. The stories we tell ourselves about why we are stuck, why we deserve sympathy, why this time it's different, why we'll start tomorrow, these are the chains, not iron, not bars, just thoughts, repeated so often they became identity. Let's break them, one at a time. Here are the 7 things weak men always do. Number 1. They seek validation. There is a particular kind of hunger that lives in a weak man's chest, and it does not announce itself loudly. It does not feel like hunger at all. It feels like ambition. It feels like connection. It feels like simply wanting to be liked, which seems harmless enough, until you realize how much of his life he has handed over to people who will never love him as much as he needs them to. The weak man checks how a room reacted to him before he decides how he feels about himself. He cannot finish a thought, a decision, an action, without first asking, silently, desperately, did that look good? Did they approve? He performs his own life instead of living it. Every choice runs through an invisible audience in his head, and that audience holds the only vote that counts. This is not vanity. Vanity would almost be easier to fix. This is something more corrosive. It is a man who has outsourced his sense of self to people who were never asked to hold it, and who, more often than not, do not even care. Consider Marcus Aurelius again, but not as emperor. Consider him as a boy, raised in a court where every gesture was watched, every word measured for political consequence, surrounded from birth by people whose approval could elevate or destroy him. He could have become a man entirely shaped by other people's opinions, a puppet performing power instead of holding it. Instead, he wrote, in the privacy of his own journal, a reminder meant for no audience but himself. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Notice what he did not write. He did not write, convince others you are good. He did not write, perform goodness so it is seen and praised. He wrote, be one. The entire weight of his philosophy rests on that distinction. Action over appearance, substance over spectacle. Now picture the opposite. Picture a man scrolling through his phone at 1 a.m, watching the numbers under his last post, refreshing, feeling his mood rise and fall with strangers' thumbs. He has built nothing. He has simply broadcast himself, waiting for the world to tell him he matters. And when the world doesn't respond the way he hoped, something in him collapses, because his entire architecture of self-worth was built on a foundation that was never his to control. This is the psychological trap. The weak man believes that if enough people validate him, the ache inside will finally go quiet. But the ache is never about the people. It is about the relationship he has failed to build with himself. No amount of external praise can patch a hole that was never external to begin with. He will chase approval for decades, accumulate followers, likes, compliments, promotions celebrated more for the title than the work, and still lie awake at night feeling like a stranger to himself, because none of it touched the actual wound. The strong man operates from a different center entirely. He still hears the opinions of others. He is not a stone, but he does not need them to feel solid. His sense of worth was built in private, in the unglamorous hours when no one was watching, in the discipline he kept when there was no reward for keeping it, in the standards he held even when breaking them would have gone unnoticed. He built his identity the way a craftsman builds a table, piece by piece with his own hands, checking the joints himself, not waiting for someone to walk by and tell him it looks nice. This is what Epictetus meant when he separated the world into two categories, what is within our control and what is not. Other people's opinions are not within your control. You can influence them, but you cannot command them. And a man who builds his foundation on something he cannot command has built his house on sand, and he will spend his entire life terrified of the tide. The validation seeker is always one bad review, one cold shoulder, one unanswered message away from a crisis, because his entire sense of self is rented, not owned. Ask yourself honestly in this exact moment, when was the last time you made a decision and didn't care, even a little, what someone else would think of it? If you cannot remember, you have found one of your 7. A man who needs the world's approval to feel whole will spend his whole life negotiating his worth with people who never agreed to set the price. Second thing, they explain themselves too much. Watch a weak man closely, and you will notice something strange. He cannot simply do something. He has to justify it. Before he acts, during the act, and long after it's finished, he is narrating, defending, pre-apologizing, building a case for himself in the court of public opinion that exists mostly in his own head. He says, "I know this might sound weird, but..." He says, "I'm sorry. I just feel like..." He says, "You probably think I'm crazy for this." He cushions every choice in so much padding that by the time he actually says what he means, the meaning has dissolved into apology. This habit looks like humility. It is not. Humility is quiet. This is something else entirely. Fear wearing humility's clothing. The weak man explains himself excessively because some part of him does not believe he has the right to simply exist as he is, to want what he wants, to choose what he chooses, without first earning permission from everyone in the room. Picture a man at a family dinner who has decided to leave a stable but soul-crushing job to start something of his own. Watch him try to tell his family. He doesn't say it. He builds an elaborate legal defense around it. He explains the savings he has, the backup plan, the statistics on success rates, the timeline, the contingency for failure, all before anyone has even asked a single question. He is not informing them. He is begging in disguise for a verdict he hasn't even been asked to await. Now picture Cato the Younger, a man so famously immovable in his convictions that even his enemies, men who despised everything he stood for, could not deny his integrity. Cato did not over-explain himself to the Roman Senate. When he believed something was right, he stated it plainly, and let the consequences fall where they fell, even when those consequences included public humiliation, political ruin, and eventually his own death. He was not reckless. He was simply finished asking the world for permission to hold his own convictions. There is a particular kind of psychological exhaustion that comes from constantly explaining yourself, because what you are really doing every time is asking an invisible jury to acquit you of the crime of being yourself. And juries, by their nature, can convict. So the over-explainer is essentially volunteering for trial after trial after trial for decisions that were never crimes to begin with. The weak man believes that if his explanation is thorough enough, airtight enough, sympathetic enough, he can control how people feel about him. He cannot. People will think what they think. Some will judge him no matter how carefully he frames his choices. Some would have supported him without a single word of justification. The explaining changes nothing about their reaction. It only reveals how much power he has handed them over his own self-respect. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he had spent enough time imagining what other people thought, what they said, what they planned against him, and that this time would have been better spent thinking about his own soul. There is an exhaustion in constant self-justification that quietly drains a man of the very energy he needs to build the life he is trying to defend. The strong man speaks once, plainly, and lets his actions stand as the only explanation that matters. If someone needs more than that, he understands that more words will not satisfy them. Only results will, eventually, or they never were going to be satisfied at all. He has made peace with being misunderstood by people whose understanding required for him to move forward. Ask yourself, how many times this week have you explained a decision to someone who had no actual say in it? Count them. That number is the size of the leash you've been wearing. A man who must explain himself to everyone has already surrendered the one thing he can never get back, the right to simply act. Third thing, they avoid discomfort. There is a kind of death that happens slowly, without a funeral, without anyone noticing, and it begins the very first time a man chooses comfort over growth and tells himself it was the smart choice. The weak man has built an entire life around the avoidance of friction. He takes the easier route home, even when the harder one would have built his patience. He skips the conversation that needed to happen because it might be uncomfortable, and tells himself he was being respectful, when really he was being a coward in a clean shirt. He stops the workout the moment it starts to burn, not because his body has reached its limit, but because his mind reached its limit decades ago and has been negotiating surrender ever since. This avoidance does not look dramatic from the outside. That is what makes it so dangerous. It looks like a man simply living a normal, modest, manageable life. But underneath that modesty is a quiet agreement he made with himself long ago. I will not push past what is easy. And every time he keeps that agreement, the boundary of what he considers possible shrinks a little more. Consider the story of a man training for something difficult, a marathon, a fight, a body transformation, anything that demands the body argue with the mind for months. In the early weeks, every single session is a negotiation. The lungs burn, the legs scream, and the mind, that ancient comfort-seeking animal sitting in the skull, offers 1,000 reasonable-sounding exits. You can stop today and start fresh tomorrow. This pace is unsustainable. You're not built for this. Most men listen to that voice because the voice sounds like wisdom. It is not wisdom. It is the oldest trick in the human mind, dressed up as self-care. Seneca wrote that the comfortable life is fertile ground for vice, that a soul lulled into too much ease becomes the soil where weakness grows roots deepest. He did not say this from outside the experience. He lived through immense wealth, exile, and eventually a forced death sentence under Nero, and through all of it he maintained that the man who has never been tested does not know what he is made of. And worse, he will find out at the worst possible moment when the testing is no longer optional. This is the trap of comfort. It feels like safety, but it is actually a delay of a bill that will eventually come due, usually with interest. The man who never trains discomfort in small doses, who never sits with difficulty on purpose, will meet it eventually anyway, in a hospital room, in a layoff, in a divorce, in a death, and he will meet it with a mind that has spent 30 years practicing only retreat. The psychological pattern underneath comfort avoidance is simple and brutal. Every time you choose ease over difficulty, you are training your brain that discomfort equals danger, and danger must be avoided at all costs. You are building, session by session, decision by decision, a nervous system that panics at the first sign of resistance. This is why so many men flinch not just at physical hardship, but at hard conversations, hard truths, hard decisions about their own lives. The avoidance becomes a reflex that touches everything. The strong man does something almost unnatural by comparison. He seeks out discomfort deliberately, not because he enjoys suffering, but because he understands that comfort and growth cannot occupy the same room at the same time. He takes the cold shower, not because it feels good in the moment, but because the moment he steps in is the moment his mind tries to negotiate, and the moment he stays is the moment he proves to himself, not to anyone watching, that his decisions are no longer hostage to his impulses. This is what the Stoics called training the will, not training the body for show, but training the part of the mind that decides whether to stop or continue, because that part of the mind, once strengthened, applies itself to every domain of life. The man who can sit through one more uncomfortable minute in the gym becomes the man who can sit through one more uncomfortable minute in a negotiation, in a confrontation, in a moment of grief. Ask yourself, what is the last hard thing you chose? Not because you had to, but because you decided to. If the answer takes too long to find, you have located another one. Comfort is not the reward at the end of a hard life. It is the trap at the beginning of a wasted one. Fourth thing, they blame others. There is a sound a weak man makes more often than he realizes, and it is not loud, but it is constant, like a low hum underneath everything he says. The sound is the word but. I would have succeeded, but. I would have left, but. I would have changed, but. And after that but comes a name, a circumstance, a system, a person who is not in the room to defend themselves, because blame always speaks loudest to an empty chair. Blame is seductive because it offers something validation and discomfort. Avoidance cannot. It offers innocence. If the failure belongs to someone else, the weak man never has to face the unbearable possibility that the failure belongs to him. He gets to keep his self-image intact, while the actual problem, the thing that needs fixing, sits untouched, because you cannot fix a problem you've assigned to someone else's hands. Picture a man who has been passed over for a promotion 3 times. Each time he has a story ready. The manager is biased. The company plays favorites. The system is rigged against people like him. Some of this might even be partially true. The world is not always fair, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But notice what he never does. He never asks the harder question, the one that actually has power in it. What is within my control here, and have I done everything possible with that? Epictetus drew the clearest line on this that has ever been drawn. He said that the foolish man blames others for his misfortunes, the average man blames himself, but the wise man blames no one. Read that progression carefully, because it is a ladder, and most men never climb past the second rung. Blaming others is the lowest level of awareness. Blaming yourself excessively is one step up, but it is still trapped in blame, just redirected inward, and it still produces nothing but paralysis. The wise man transcends blame entirely. He simply asks, what happened, and what do I do now? This is not the same as pretending injustice does not exist. The Stoics were not naive men living in comfortable times. Epictetus himself was born into slavery. Seneca was exiled and eventually ordered to take his own life. Marcus Aurelius ruled during plagues, wars, and the betrayal of those closest to him. These were men who had every reason, every legitimate, justified reason, to blame the world for what was done to them. And yet the philosophy they built, forged in actual suffering, not theoretical suffering, insists that blame is a dead end, because blame focuses all your energy on a door that is not yours to open. The psychological cost of chronic blame is rarely discussed, but it is severe. A man who blames others for his circumstances has, without realizing it, handed those people permanent rent-free space in his mind. He thinks about them, he rehearses arguments with them, he carries resentment that does nothing to them and everything to him, like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to suffer. There is a particular kind of bitterness in men who have blamed for so long that it has become their personality, their conversation topic, their identity. They are still, in their own minds, 20 years old, wronged by a parent, a partner, a boss, a betrayal, and every year that passes without addressing it does not heal the wound. It just makes the wound the loudest room in the house. The strong man asks a different question entirely, and it is a brutal question, one most men avoid because the answer is rarely comfortable. Even if this was unfair, even if I did not deserve this, what is the next right action available to me? He does not deny injustice. He simply refuses to let injustice become the architecture of his identity. He takes what is his to take responsibility for, and he releases what is not because releasing it is easy, but because holding on to it costs more than it could ever give back. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. This is not motivational poster language. It is a complete reversal of how most men process obstacles. The obstacle is not proof that you should stop. It is the raw material of the next version of yourself, if you are willing to stop blaming it and start working with it. Ask yourself, who have you been blaming quietly for years, for a life you have not yet taken full ownership of? Say the name in your mind. Now ask whether that person is still controlling your future, or whether you have simply continued giving them the wheel out of habit. A man who blames the world for his position in it will hold that position forever, because he has made sure the solution always depends on someone else moving first. Fifth thing, they chase pleasure. There is a particular silence that follows pleasure, after the food, after the scrolling, after the drink, after the noise, a silence that the weak man cannot tolerate, and so he fills it immediately with the next hit of stimulation, because in that silence lives a question he has been running from for years. Is this actually who I want to be? The chasing of pleasure is rarely about the pleasure itself. It is about anesthesia. A man who structures his evenings around food he doesn't need, content he doesn't remember the next day, substances that quiet his mind instead of sharpening it, is not pursuing joy. He is administering a sedative to a problem that sedation cannot solve. And because the relief is real, even if temporary, he mistakes the silencing of discomfort for the absence of a problem. Picture a man who comes home from a day that left him feeling small, unseen, unimportant. He does not sit with that feeling. He cannot. So he opens an app, and for the next 3 hours his attention is auctioned off in small increments to algorithms built by people who have studied exactly how to keep a tired, undisciplined mind from ever looking inward. He goes to bed having felt nothing real all evening, having processed nothing, having grown nowhere, and tomorrow the same feeling of smallness will be waiting for him, untouched, slightly larger, because he fed everything except the actual hunger. Seneca, writing to a friend named Lucilius, described pleasure-chasing men with a kind of clinical pity. He said they live as though they will live forever, never noticing how much time they have already wasted, spending it as though it were endless, when in fact every hour given to empty pleasure is an hour stolen from a life that has an ending none of us can see in advance. He was not condemning enjoyment itself. The Stoics were not opposed to pleasure as a concept. He was condemning the chase, the compulsive, repetitive reaching for sensation, as a way of avoiding the difficult, necessary, often unpleasant work of building a life with substance. This is the psychological mechanism at play. Pleasure chasing creates a feedback loop that mimics satisfaction without ever delivering it. The brain receives a dopamine signal, briefly feels relief, and then, because the underlying issue, the loneliness, the dissatisfaction, the lack of purpose was never addressed, the craving returns within hours, sometimes minutes. The weak man spends his entire life on this treadmill, working harder and harder to chase a feeling that requires increasingly larger doses to produce smaller and smaller effects. Because that is the nature of all anesthesia. It builds tolerance. It never builds character. There is something almost tragic in watching a man with real potential spend his only finite resource, time, on entertainment that will not remember him, on substances that will diminish him, on relationships built only around shared numbness rather than shared growth. He is not lazy in the way people mean when they use that word casually. He is, in a deeper sense, terrified, because facing the actual conditions of his life would require him to admit how far he has drifted from who he wanted to be, and pleasure offers him an exit from that admission every single night, for the cost of his future. The strong man treats pleasure the way a craftsman treats fire, useful, even necessary, when controlled and placed correctly, devastating when allowed to spread without limit. He enjoys food without using it as therapy. He enjoys rest without using it as escape. He understands that the discipline is not in denying every pleasure, monk-like, but in remaining the one who decides when pleasure is invited in, rather than the one who is dragged behind it, like a man tied to a runaway horse. Marcus Aurelius wrote that very little is needed to make a happy life, that it is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. This was not an abstract idea to him. He held the most powerful position in the known world, with access to every pleasure available to any human being in his era, and still concluded that none of it touched the actual source of a well-lived life. If the most powerful man on earth could not buy his way to peace through pleasure, No amount of scrolling, drinking, or distraction will manufacture it for the rest of us either. Ask yourself honestly, what do you reach for every single day the moment things get quiet? That object, that app, that drink, that compulsion is not your comfort. It is your confession. It tells you more honestly than you'd ever admit out loud exactly what you're avoiding. A man who spends his life chasing pleasure will arrive at the end of it having felt everything and built nothing. Sixth thing, they talk more than they act. There is a specific kind of man who has perfected the language of change without ever practicing the discipline of it. He can describe his goals with stunning detail. He knows the books, the routines, the philosophies, the systems other successful men have used. He talks about the version of himself he is becoming with such conviction that people around him start to believe it too. And yet months pass, years pass, and the man in the mirror remains exactly where he was when the talking started. This is one of the cruelest patterns of weakness because it disguises itself as progress. Talking about a goal activates some of the same psychological reward as actually working toward it. The brain, in its primitive wiring, cannot always distinguish between announcing an intention and fulfilling one. So the weak man tells his friends about the business he's going to start and feels, in that moment, a flicker of the identity of an entrepreneur without having done a single hour of the actual unglamorous work that identity requires. The talking becomes a substitute for the doing, because talking is easy and immediate, and doing is hard and slow. Picture two men standing in the same room, both wanting the same future. One spends the evening explaining, passionately, persuasively, exactly how he plans to transform his life starting Monday. The other says almost nothing, goes home, and writes down the one task he will complete before he allows himself to sleep. A year later, the difference between these two men will not be explainable by talent or luck. It will be explainable entirely by which one of them stopped narrating and started moving. Marcus Aurelius held himself to a standard most men today would find almost unbearable. He wrote, "Do not waste time discussing what makes a good man. Be one." He was Emperor of Rome. He had every excuse to philosophize endlessly about virtue from a throne, surrounded by people who would have applauded every word. Instead, his private journal, the one document we have that shows what he actually believed when no one was listening, is filled almost entirely with reminders to himself about action. Get up in the morning even when it's hard. Do the work in front of you. Stop waiting to feel ready. There is a particular trap inside excessive talking, and it is this. Every time a man describes his future plans to an audience, he receives a small social reward, a nod, a compliment, a moment of being seen as ambitious or driven. That reward, small as it is, can quietly satisfy enough of the craving for accomplishment that the actual accomplishment starts to feel less urgent. Psychologists have observed this exact phenomenon. People who announce their goals publicly are sometimes less likely to achieve them, because the announcement itself delivered some of the emotional payoff the achievement was supposed to provide. This explains why so many men can speak with total fluency about discipline, about stoicism, about self-mastery, while their actual lives remain undisciplined, reactive, and stalled. Knowledge of a path is not the same as walking it. A man can recite every principle Epictetus ever wrote and still flinch at the first uncomfortable phone call he needs to make. The philosophy was never meant to be recited. It was meant to be lived in the unglamorous, unwitnessed minutes that make up the actual architecture of a life. The strong man understands something the talker does not. That action, even small action, carries a kind of evidence that words never will. He does not need to announce the version of himself he is building, because he is too busy building him. When he does speak about his goals, it is sparse, specific, and almost always followed immediately by movement, because for him, speech is not a substitute for the work. It is, at most, a brief signal flare before he goes back underground to actually dig. Seneca wrote that we should choose as a guide someone whose life, not merely whose words, we admire, because words alone reveal nothing about the actual character behind them. Anyone can speak convincingly. Far fewer can act consistently. The gap between those two abilities is where most men's potential quietly goes to die. Ask yourself, in the last 30 days, how many times have you described a change you're going to make, versus how many times you actually made one? If the first number dwarfs the second, you have found one of the most common patterns of all. A man who talks about the mountain his whole life will die at its base, while the man who said nothing was already standing at the summit. Seventh thing, they fear judgment. Of all 7 patterns, this is the root from which most of the others grow. Underneath the validation-seeking, underneath the over-explaining, underneath even some of the pleasure-chasing, sits a single ancient fear, the fear of being seen, judged, and found lacking. It is in many ways the oldest fear a human being can carry, older than the fear of death itself, because being cast out of the group once meant death for thousands of years of human history, and the nervous system has not forgotten that lesson, even though the stakes have changed completely. The weak man organizes his entire life around the avoidance of this exposure. He does not start the business because if it fails, people will see. He does not ask the question in the meeting because if it sounds foolish, people will notice. He does not pursue the woman, the opportunity, the bold and uncertain path, because the possibility of public failure feels more unbearable than the certainty of private stagnation. He would rather fail quietly, in a way no one witnesses, than risk failing loudly, in a way everyone does. This fear is rarely named out loud, because naming it requires the very exposure it's trying to avoid. So instead, it disguises itself as practicality. He calls it being realistic. He calls it knowing his place. He calls it not wanting to make a fool of himself. But underneath every one of those phrases is the same trembling question. What will they think of me if this doesn't work? Consider the story, often told, of Diogenes, the philosopher who lived with almost nothing, who slept in a barrel, who walked through the busiest marketplace of Athens at midday carrying a lit lamp, telling anyone who asked that he was searching for an honest man. He was mocked constantly. Children threw things at him. Wealthy men sneered as they passed. And Diogenes did something almost incomprehensible to a man ruled by fear of judgment. He let the mockery land, absorbed nothing from it, and kept walking, because he had already decided that the opinions of people who had never once examined their own lives held no authority over how he chose to live his. This is the line that separates the man ruled by judgment from the man who has made peace with it. It is not that the strong man is never mocked, never criticized, never misunderstood. Diogenes was mocked his entire life. The difference is that mockery from people he did not respect simply failed to register as information worth acting on. He had already done the harder work of deciding internally what he believed a good life looked like, and once that decision was made with conviction, the noise of strangers lost its grip on him entirely. Marcus Aurelius wrote something extraordinary on this exact subject. He said to ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? And notice how much of what you do and say is unnecessary and how much could be eliminated, including especially the constant tracking of what others think of you. He understood that the human mind has limited bandwidth, and every ounce spent monitoring other people's opinions is an ounce unavailable for the actual work of living well. The psychological cost of judgment fear compounds over decades in a way few men ever calculate honestly. Every opportunity declined because of what people might say becomes a smaller life. Every honest word swallowed because it might offend becomes a slightly more dishonest relationship. Every bold idea abandoned because it might fail publicly becomes a quiet vote for mediocrity, cast again and again, year after year, until the man looks back at 60 and realizes the only consistent author of his limitations was never the world. It was his own permission, withheld from himself, out of fear of an audience that, in most cases, was barely paying attention to begin with. This is perhaps the cruelest detail in the entire pattern. The people most men fear judgment from are not actually watching as closely as the fear suggests. Most people are consumed by their own anxieties, their own performances, their own fear of judgment. The audience the weak man is so terrified of disappointing is, in most cases, an audience of other frightened people, equally consumed with worrying about what he thinks of them. The entire structure, examined closely, is built on mutual, unspoken fear, an agreement no one actually signed, enforced by everyone, benefiting no one. The strong man does not become indifferent to all feedback. That would be its own kind of foolishness, a different flavor of weakness, wearing confidence as a mask. He listens carefully to people whose judgment he respects, whose lives demonstrate wisdom he wants more of. But he has drawn a hard, permanent line around the opinions of people who have not earned the authority to shape his decisions, and inside that line he moves freely, undistracted by the noise outside it. Epictetus offered the clearest possible instruction on this. He said that if you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid by outsiders. Notice that he did not say this would be easy, or that it wouldn't sting. He said be content with it, because the alternative, organizing your entire life around never appearing foolish, guarantees you will never attempt anything large to risk looking foolish in the first place. Ask yourself, what have you not done, not said, not become, purely because you were afraid of how it would look? Sit with that question longer than feels comfortable. Most men answer it too quickly with a shrug, because the honest answer is heavier than they want to carry in a casual moment. A man who spends his life terrified of judgment will receive, in the end, the only judgment that ever truly mattered, his own, delivered far too late, in the quiet of his final years, when there is no more time left to act on what he finally understood. You will not fix all 7 of these tonight. You may not fix even one of them this month. But somewhere in the last hour, something in you recognized itself in these words, and that recognition is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only place real change has ever begun. Not in motivation, not in inspiration. In the uncomfortable, unglamorous moment, a man stops lying to himself about which version of him has been running the show. The weak man and the strong man are not two different people. They are the same man at two different moments, making two different choices. The only question that has ever mattered, the question every Stoic from Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius to Seneca built their entire philosophy around, is which version of yourself you choose to feed today, not tomorrow. Not when conditions improve, not when you feel ready, because readiness is a feeling, and feelings were never meant to be in charge of a man's direction. Today, choose the version of you that does not need an audience to act with integrity. Choose the version of you that does not need to explain a decision he knows is right. Choose the version of you that leans into the discomfort instead of flinching from it. Choose the version of you that takes the weight of his own life onto his own shoulders, blames no one, and moves anyway. Choose the version of you that can sit in silence without needing to escape it. Choose the version of you that acts first and speaks, if at all, after. And choose the version of you that has finally stopped asking permission from people who were never going to be in the room when the real work got done. That man is not a fantasy. He is not a future version of you that exists only in imagination. He is available right now, in the next decision you make after this video ends, in the next 5 minutes, in the choice between picking up your phone or picking up the work you've been avoiding. The Stoics did not believe in waiting for the perfect moment to become who you were meant to be. They believed the moment you are in, exactly as uncomfortable, exactly as inconvenient as it is the only moment you will ever actually have. So stand up, not someday, now. Because the weak man waits for a sign, the strong man becomes one.